Good morning, everybody. Today's Numbers Day, and welcome to this Workers by the Numbers blogcast presented by the Power at Work blog. I'm Seth Harris, a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change, and we're going to talk about the latest jobs, unemployment, and wages report that was released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics just 15 minutes ago. So we've given it the comprehensive 15 minutes of analysis that a report of this importance requires. Joining me in analyzing the numbers are three really top-notch labor economists who have a lot of experience digging through these data and telling us what they mean, especially what they mean for workers. First, my colleague at Northeastern University, professor of economics in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and research director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, Alicia Modestino. Good morning, Alicia.
Good morning, Seth.
And second, my former Labor Department colleague and now the chief economist for the AFL-CIO and a professor of economics at Howard University, Bill Spriggs. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning.
And certainly not least, but absolutely last right now, at least the senior researcher at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, Aaron Sojourner. Hi, Aaron.
Hey, everybody. Hi, Seth.
So let's get right into it. Here are the headline numbers from BLS's March. What month is it? March. From BLS's March employment situation report, the unemployment rate fell to 3.5%. Last month, it was 3.6%. The unemployment rate has been fairly steady for slightly more than a year. It's been between 3.4% and 3.7%, and a little bouncing around in that range really doesn't tell us very much. The economy created 236,000 jobs in March. That's a decrease from February's increase of 316,000 jobs, and January's surprising 472,000 jobs. It was actually more surprising when it was initially announced because it was over 500,000 jobs, but it was actually 472,000 jobs in January. The average increase in 2022 was 401,000 jobs per month, which is a very fast, extremely fast job creation pace. So far, 2023 is slower, but I don't think that's the least bit surprising either. Average hourly earnings increased by 9 cents or 0.3% from February to March. That is slightly faster than the 8-cent or 0.2% increase that we saw from January to February. Comparing that to inflation, though, we only have the February inflation numbers. We don't have the March inflation numbers yet. Depending upon which measure you use, inflation is running at either about a 6% annual rate or a 5% annual rate. So workers' wages are somewhat behind the inflation rate. Workers are losing money on real wages terms. So let's turn to our experts. They're going to tell us what it means, particularly what it means for workers. Let me start with you, Alicia. Are these numbers good for workers? Are they bad for workers? Or would you say it's a mixed bag?
I'd say it's a little bit of a mixed bag in the sense that, we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown in the labor market where, the pace of hiring is not as fast. I would call it more of a normalization. I think we've been running the labor market very hot for very long, and it was expected that we would see this kind of slowdown. We've seen job openings dip below 10 million for the first time, in the past 2 years, I think it's been. It was unclear if it would be sustainable above that. I think there's some question if we're in the new normal. And Bill and I were chatting about that before we jumped on here. But, if you look at the pace of hires and separations, it's been pretty steady. Like, since over the past 2 years, we've seen hires, holding steady about, 6 million or so a month. Same thing with separations. So I think we're normalizing, and it's pretty much even all over the country. The one thing where I say it's a mixed bag is that the anxiety is rising, right? So as we see the slowdown in job creation, some folks are getting laid off. We see, Challenger, Gray, and Christmas coming out and telling us that, there were 90,000 layoffs in March. That's not small. I myself like to look at Google Trends. If you look at Google Trends for the words laid off for the past 12 months, it's doubled. So people are very anxious about their jobs. But again, we're mostly seeing it in places where maybe we needed to readjust after a lot of fast hiring in the tech sector, finance, shipping. Those are mostly where we're seeing these layoffs and these slowdowns. And again, if you look at the characteristics of the unemployment insurance claimants, they're in these industries. And, if you look at the pace of hiring overall, we're still seeing other industries like leisure and hospitality, healthcare, that are offsetting those losses that we're seeing in tech and finance. So I'm going to go with mixed bag right now.
Okay, Bill, Alicia says it's a mixed bag. What do you think? Is it good for workers, bad for workers, or is it a mixed bag? You're on mute, sir.
Sorry, I had a phone ringing. I think it's kind of a mixed bag in the sense that it's a pace of job creation that's keeping the overall unemployment level relatively flat. And so despite people thinking it's a really rapid job growth, we remember the labor force participation continues to recover. And I think we continue to underestimate how many people are sitting on the bench who would participate. And so the fact that we've added in a 3-month period well over 1 million jobs, and the unemployment rate hasn't responded that much. It's really been a response of labor force participation that I think we just are totally underestimating the size of the labor force. And we had a very unusual bouncing back and forth in the reconciliation of what's in the household survey and what's in the payroll survey. They don't have to line up at all, and the experimental number that BLS generates to make the numbers equivalent, well, that number is bounced around in the last couple of months. So I think from the workers' perspective, it's a little long-term unemployment inched up. That's a bad sign. It's saying that this return to labor force participation is making it harder for those who are longer in the queue, and it's harder for them to land jobs. That's a group that often has difficulty when the labor market isn't doing too well. We saw some gains in state and local government, which is a good sign that state and local governments are coming to their senses. The work week wasn't changed that much over the month. So the idea that it's so tight that companies are running, huge amounts of overtime and are pressing, that doesn't seem to be accelerating. And most of the sectors held on in terms of the ones that are often cyclically responsive. Construction continues to add jobs and make records each month, and manufacturing kind of held on. So I think it's a mixed bag, and given I think that the Fed doesn't understand the labor market anymore, it's bad because they will interpret this as the labor market is too tight, we're generating too many jobs. So that's the true downside here.
Gotcha. Aaron, we got 2 mixed bags. What do you think? Good for workers, bad for workers, or a mixed bag?
I mean, I think overall it's pretty positive report. It's good to see job growth continuing, and it's very good to see labor force and employment population share, especially prime age population, continuing to grow.
Explain what you mean by that. Prime age.
So the share of adults who are employed is growing, and the share of workers between age 25 and 54 who are kind of in their central working years. It's a measure of sort of core labor market strength that doesn't pay attention to people who might be in college, people who might be on the edge of retirement, but focuses on sort of the core earning years. Is it's growing. I'll come back to that in a bit, but there is softening. You know, job growth is decelerating. Wage growth is modest. Like it's very hard for me to. Wage growth has been decelerating. It depends sort of the time horizon you look at, but there's not, there's certainly not like an acceleration of wage growth. So that says that supply is maybe expanding a little, but demand must be expanding some too. And, wages are growing, but at a slower pace than a few months ago, which is, this is all, I think, roughly good news in the sense that the Fed has got their eye on all this and threatening to provoke a recession if they think there's too much heat here. And so this path seems consistent with potentially a soft landing. And that's good news. But on its face,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish it up.
No, but on its face, it's wage growth is moderating. That's not super exciting for working families. They like raises, and it's good maybe for consumers, for company owners, for seniors, retirees.
Yeah, so I'm with Aaron on this one, and I'm going to maintain my reputation as the optimist in the group. I think that this report is very good for workers. It's just not quite as good as what we have gotten accustomed to over the last couple of years during the post-COVID recovery, or the late COVID and post-COVID recovery. I mean, if you step back from the report a little bit, there's lots and lots of jobs for lots and lots of workers. Wages are continuing to rise, not as quickly, so it's comparatively it's not as good, but in absolute terms, workers are getting more money in their pockets. Now they're losing some of that to inflation. You'd like to have them getting faster wage increases and have real wage increases, feel it more in the pocketbook, but lots of jobs, wages are increasing, and I think most important, we're sharing the prosperity much more broadly. More and more workers are coming into the labor market, are seeking and finding jobs. There's a lot of jobs there's 1.6 jobs for every unemployed worker. If you throw in the workers who are out of the labor market and want to work, you get to a little closer to 1-to-1, but not quite there. So my perspective on it is that workers are doing pretty well in this economy and are continuing to do well. Now, there is the tendency to sort of predict where we're heading, and this is a trend line, and we're headed, I wrote a piece this week about how many predictions of recession have we seen. The economics world has predicted 10 recessions for every one we've actually had. That's essentially what we're experiencing now. There was actually an article in the New York Times today predicting recessions. There are articles, that the anxiety that Alicia is talking about is around partly because we keep talking about how these numbers are pointing to really bad outcomes. But for right now, and certainly in the recent past, workers are doing just fine, are doing just great. I think that the warnings that both Aaron and Bill are giving, and Alicia, you too, about the Federal Reserve and how they're going to react to it are absolutely relevant. I think their decision-making is just terrible. But in the decision-making that's going on in labor markets every day, employers are looking for workers. They are finding workers. Workers are quitting their jobs and finding better jobs. Boy, that's the picture of the kind of labor market where workers can really do well. So I'm going to be Mr. Optimist and look at these numbers and choose to say the glass is 7/8 full. And maybe it's leaking a little bit at the bottom. We're going to have to see how that goes. All right, let's turn to our next question. And this is a very important one. It's a chance for the three of you to riff and to give us your thoughts about the parts of this report that were most striking, most important to you. So it's time for stat of the day. Bill, what is your statistic of the day? What is the statistic, or two or three? Don't go over three, though. What is the one or two or three set of statistics that you focused on in the report that you think are really telling or really important? Or tell us about a population of workers that maybe we're not talking about enough.
Well, For the first time, the employment to population ratio for Black workers is slightly higher than for white workers. We've been edging to where the EPOP for Blacks and whites were almost the same, but this is the first time it's actually been.
Explain
above that.
EPOP. Explain EPOP for the folks who
So,
aren't read in on our acronym usage here.
Yeah, so for many people, their sense of unemployment is, do you have a job? They don't get into the nuance that some people really aren't in the labor force. People don't accept that idea, but there really are people who either they're retired or they're in school full time or they're caring for their kids and have no interest in being in the labor force. So the common notion is how many people are employed divided by how many people are there. That is the common view of how the labor market functions. So for the first time, there's a higher share of Blacks who are holding a job than whites. And so that's rather astounding. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that the labor force participation for Black workers has been continuing to decline. This was true during the recovery from the Great Recession towards the end, just pre-pandemic. But during this return to work from COVID has been even more rapid and more pronounced. So that's quite significant. Now, last month, the unemployment rate for the first time for white high school dropouts was higher than the Black unemployment rate. Normally, the unemployment rate for white high school dropouts is lower than the Black unemployment rate. And so whenever anybody, is on my case about why do you want macroeconomic policy to quote unquote run tight and shouldn't Blacks just get more education? It's like you're totally ignoring the key factor of our labor force. A white high school dropout has a lower unemployment rate than the Black population. And education does not help explain what the Black unemployment rate is. So for the last 2 months, education actually kind of matters because the fact that most Black people are not high school dropouts, the overwhelming majority are not high school dropouts. Now we can start to have a conversation about what can education do. But until the last 2 months, that was a stupid conversation. Now this month, the unemployment rate for white high school dropouts pretty much equal to Black unemployment rate. So we're not totally over the hump where education matters. Race is still too important a variable, but at least we're getting close to how people in their minds think the labor market works. And that's good. So on both counts, those things are good. The Hispanic employment to population ratio has been higher than the white employment population ratio many times because Hispanics have a much higher labor force participation than whites. And for Black women, they've almost always had a higher employment to population ratio than white women. Again, because the labor force participation of Black women has always been higher than for white women, except when we have really, really bad labor markets. So, so those are the pluses. I think we have to remember, Aaron had an excellent posting about this. The post-pandemic world is different. We've had a recovery for younger workers in terms of labor force participation. Younger workers are predominantly workers of color. And so if you don't pay attention to what's happening to Black and brown workers, this is where the marginal activity is taking place. This is where the change is going to come from, because these are the workers who are driving the numbers in the margin. The job stayers are not the drivers of the numbers. So the fact that the labor force continues to improve for Black and Hispanic workers is really key. And the fact that their labor force participation continues to recover is really key, and tells you a lot more about whether the labor market is tight or not. And so I think in that sense, things were very encouraging.
Great. I really like that one. Aaron, let me come to you next and see if you want to jump in on this conversation about not just workers of colors, but your own analysis of younger workers, but choose whatever stat of the day you'd like. But I wonder if you want to jump in on Bill's point about younger workers.
Yeah, I definitely do. Let me put my number out there and I'll loop back. So the stat that strikes me the most is the prime age employment share, which is rose to 80.7%, which puts it above the pre-pandemic, like the immediate pre-pandemic level. The labor market was pretty tight before the pandemic, and there were a lot of people who wanted jobs, could find jobs, but now the prime age employment share is above that. It's actually the highest now in 22 years, and it's close to it. It's close to the peak that it ever got to in 2000. So it's back to like 2001 levels, sort of rivaling the historical peak it's still like a point off, 1 percentage point off, but closer than we've been. And so, as we talked about before, that's kind of a measure of core labor market strength. And so that's, I think, really good news. There is kind of a little bit of a bad news angle on it, in the sense that, and this goes back to age, what we've seen in the labor market since the pandemic is that in 2020, when the pandemic first hit, because there was like a really strong, much greater health risks for older Americans, a lot of older Americans quit the labor force and went on to the sidelines to protect their health. And some of them had housing equity or retirement savings, and felt like they could pull back from earning. And if you look at sort of who's not working now, it's pretty much all people who are retirement age, over 65. If you look at the employment rates by age, it's fallen, 2 percentage points for people over age 55, especially people over age 65, sort of accelerated late retirement. And so that's taken a lot of people who were in the labor market out, and bless them, they worked for many years. They're if they don't want to work now, and they don't have to work now, like, I don't think that's bless them. It's not a problem, but what it means is that the labor force for people who are young workers and prime age workers, or prime age, middle age workers, there's more demand for them. And so I think part of what's happening with why prime age labor for employment is high is because we're sort of missing a lot of people who were older who might have been working. And I guess maybe they're going to come, some of them will come back into the labor market, but I'm not sure. We see young people really working at much higher rates, especially the youngest work. So like, say 18 to 22, like that age range, working more. So, when you hear people say people don't want to work anymore, think senior citizens don't want to work anymore, and know that, young people, middle-aged people are working more than they were before the pandemic.
Yeah, that's such an important point about older workers, and we had our friend Teresa Ghilarducci on last month and talked a little bit about older workers. One of the problems with the older workers leaving the labor market and not coming back, they used to go in and out of the labor market, now they're just going out and not coming back, is that we really don't know if they have enough money to live on, or if they have enough money at least to sustain a reasonable lifestyle. We know that except for the very, very lowest wage workers, that Social Security benefits are not enough to replace even a lion's share of their incomes. The average replacement rate for Social Security is about 40% of pre-retirement wages. And, since very few people now have pensions, they're relying on whatever they've been able to save, or whatever equity they have in their house, or whatever other accumulated wealth they've been able to pull together. So we don't know if those people who are not working are doing that because of fear, because they can't find a job, because of age discrimination, or if it's because they have enough money. We just don't know if they have enough money.
I think it's clearly a mix of sort of these good reasons, like I have a lot of savings and my house has a lot of equity, and bad reasons like I'm scared for my health, and it's the more privileged among us who have those options to stay out, and it's doesn't mean it's everyone. But that's where the change has been in that group.
Right, absolutely. All right, Alicia, your statistic or statistics of the day.
All right. Well, anybody who knows me and knows my research, that this is the time of year where I am thinking a lot about summer jobs. I'm thinking a lot about the absolute youngest people in our labor force. And so I'm going to turn to them. I'm talking about teenagers age 16 to 19. Not only is this a population that I care very much about with my own children, but also it's a population that we look to for the future, but also it's our most vulnerable population, right? They have the least amount of job experience. I see them a little bit as a leading indicator in the labor market, because they're often the last to be hired, the first to be fired. So when I'm looking at this jobs report, what I'm seeing is we're, again, a little bit of a mixed bag on these folks. So back in 2019, the unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds in March was 12.5%. And in 2022, so this time last year, it was 10.1%. And that swung us into like the best summer for teenagers that we have seen in decades, where young people, if they wanted, they could be employed, gainfully employed, and at pretty high wage rates. Where we are now in 2023, we have an unemployment rate of 11.1% for 16 to 19-year-olds. So right in between those two numbers. So again, we're scrubbing off a little bit maybe of the enthusiasm for employers to turn to young people as a source of labor to backfill for some of what Aaron was just talking about, where older folks have left the labor market or have decided, I do not want that entry level wait staff job. Teenagers do, they need it, it's their first job. However, I do want to emphasize a little bit of what Bill was talking about, that this rising tide does not lift all boats equally still, even when we have a continually strong labor market. So right now in March of 2023, the unemployment rate for Black teenagers 16 to 19 is 14.5%. For whites, it's 8.5%. For Hispanics, it's in between, it's 12.4%. So, I was just at a big press event yesterday with Mayor Wu in Boston to announce an expansion of the city's summer youth employment program. They're going to hire an extra 1,000 youth this summer. And it's exactly for the reasons why we've seen historically big cities like Boston, New York, Chicago, having these kinds of summer youth employment programs, because this kind of opportunity is not spread equally across all populations. And so for young people who grow up in neighborhoods with fewer job opportunities, schools that maybe are lagging behind, these are an important source of meaningful job opportunities that can really put them on a career path or a track for post-secondary education. And we've got really great research evidence that shows that participating in these programs increases high school graduation, boosts college enrollment, lowers criminal justice involvement, and increases the likelihood of being employed and wage rates that these young people are earning. And that's in like the 1, 2, 3 years after participating. So that's my statistic, my soapbox. I'm going to keep watching this number pretty closely as we swing into the summer. But again, I'm optimistic, but cautiously optimistic, Seth.
That's another great one. That's the difference between you and me, is that you're more cautious, I think, in your optimism than I am. So for my stat of the day, or a combination of stats of the day, I want to talk about the relationship between wages and the folks who, as Bill described it, are on the bench or spending part of the game sitting on the bench, and also the average hourly work week. Because we hear endless discussions about how terribly tight the labor market is, and employers, for a long time, although we don't hear it quite as much now, were complaining they couldn't find workers. There are skill shortages, there are worker shortages, and all these those arguments are being used as justifications for really despicable legislation across the country that will make it easier to 13, 14, and 15-year-olds to work, because, oh my goodness, we can't possibly find an adult worker, so we have to clean our factory with a 14-year-old migrant worker child instead. But wages have been up, and when wages are up, we expect more workers to want to work, to be willing to work, to come off the bench, as Bill described it. They want to supply their labor more. And that's precisely what is happening. For 2 months in a row now, we have seen 200,000 workers who were not in the labor force enter the labor force. They told us they wanted a job. They went out and found a job. So the wage mechanism is actually serving its purpose of bringing workers back into the labor market, sharing our prosperity more broadly with workers who are marginalized in our economy and in our labor markets. The argument that employers are absolutely desperate for people is not supported by the other data. We are not seeing, as Bill said, we're not seeing the average work week increase dramatically. We're not seeing workers working large amounts of overtime in manufacturing. We are seeing that, but that's more traditional in manufacturing. And we still have, and this has been the number for several months now, 4.1 million workers who are working part-time who would like to work full-time. That's the group of workers that you would expect employers to call on and move them from part-time to full-time, or lure them from a part-time job into a full-time job with a different employer. And we are still not seeing that number going below what are historically low numbers. I mean, this is about the level we were at in the late 1990s and 2000. But we would expect to see that number going a lot lower if employers really were desperate for workers. So my hope is that we're not going to see continued efforts, particularly by the Federal Reserve, to hold down, drive down wages, because it is working. It is helping us to help the workers who are most disadvantaged in the economy, the people who were driven out of the economy, who weren't making sufficient wages to justify working. Now they're coming back in and we're sharing it. I think that's part of the story that Bill is talking about with respect to Black workers and Latino workers. It's part of the younger workers story. Aaron's point about older workers leaving and staying out of the labor market is a very, very important one. But those workers would not be describing themselves as wanting a job, being out of the labor market and wanting a job. So I think that's a very important statistic. As you know, I watch that every month. I think it's a very important, because I think the rhetoric about labor market tightness is far overblown. I think we're caught up in this cycle of employers endlessly saying, I can't find anybody, God forbid, what am I going to do? I think what we're seeing right now is employers clinging to workers desperately because they're afraid they're not going to be able to respond to demand, and demand is still pretty strong in the economy. So let's wrap it up with our final question. We're running a little bit over time, but that's okay, because the conversation is, I think, just terrific. So we always are focused on worker power here at the Power at Work blog. So the big question, Aaron, is what do these numbers tell us about worker power? Are we seeing workers' bargaining power, particularly individual bargaining power, declining? Are we seeing it rising? Is it staying pretty steady?
I think it's high. It's been high, but it's slowly easing a bit, is my take. Just you can see it in the wage growth rates. You can see it in quits and layoffs. So we're workers are still on strong ground, but a little less strong than 6 months ago, a year ago.
Yeah, that's a good start for a take. Alicia, what's your take? Worker power.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in terms of employers desperately holding on to their workers. They're hedging their bets about, not wanting to face turnover. But at the same time, we're seeing, on job ads that fewer job ads are listing benefits like health insurance, paid time off, retirement benefits. So employers are starting to squeak around the margins where they can, especially with their new hires. So I'm a little worried that, again, we're in this position where strong labor market gets you a job, maybe gets you a pay raise, but then, once we start to see some of that softness, that we do start to see that erosion along these sort of hidden, invisible dimensions. So I'm a little worried about that.
Yeah. Okay, Bill, what do you think? You're the economist to the most important labor power organization in the United States, worker power organization. What do you think? Is worker power increasing, decreasing? Is it staying stagnant? Or we have reason for worry, reason for hope? What do you think?
Well, we still haven't seen employers rolling over when it comes to bargaining. They still bargain as if we had 80% unemployment, which has been astounding. And so on that level, it's been discouraging that firms are still using this moment to squeeze as much profit as they can, and are still trying to use workers to balance their cost. So I think the jury's still out. But workers who want to organize, I think this continues to strengthen. And the gains made because of the minimum wage are beginning to fade because all the states that had legislation to raise the minimum wage were reaching whatever target they set. So the extra boost we were getting from job switching that is induced by the minimum wage increase is tampered down, but we're still seeing enough job switching that workers are holding on. I just hope that the lesson from this is it's better to sprint to recover the labor market and get to full employment than what the Fed is doing, which is to sprint to get prices down. Inflation should be viewed as a marathon. And we've already been through, oh, it's a marathon. We'll eventually get the jobs back, which destroys a whole generation of workers and continues to create huge imbalances in bargaining power. I think the correct formula, we've shown it. I hope that the Fed continues to have a moment to come to its senses, and we will look back on this as the golden era of public policy, that we sprinted to get people back in their jobs and make the economy work, and that it was possible, that we did it, and the benefits of that are just hard to measure.
Yeah. So I'm going to give two answers. Moderator's prerogative. I'm going to say both yes and no. I published a piece on the Power at Work blog last week about how 2023 is the year of collective bargaining. The biggest issue in labor in 2023 is going to be collective bargaining. There are some gigantic contracts that are either going to be starting negotiations, like the UPS negotiations, the negotiations between the UAW and the big three automakers. There are some negotiations that I think we're going to see wrap up, hopefully fairly soon, the West Coast ports negotiations, but we also have the negotiations with newly organized units at Starbucks, Amazon, if you can call what's going on there anything like the preparations for collective bargaining. I think it's hard to make that case because of Amazon's intransigence and law breaking. So on the collective bargaining side, I think we have to give an incomplete right now. We have to wait to see what happens with these gigantic contracts all across the United States in industry after industry after industry, to really know what the state of the labor market, what the effect of the labor market is on the state of collective bargaining. With respect to individual bargaining, I think workers are still going pretty strong. I think the point about wages slowing down is a very important indicator that wage growth, because it's slowing down, suggests that workers' ability to bargain for higher wages, to the extent they even have that ability at all in an individual context, is beginning to decline a little bit. But the number that I point to is one that Alicia pointed to and Bill mentioned as well, that it's the take this job and shove it statistic, which is the monthly quits. The number of workers who every month are just telling their employer, forget it, you're not giving me what I want, I'm going to go find another job. And that number had declined below 4,000 for the first time in 19 months, I think it was. In January and February, it bumped up above 4 million. And that may very well be, at least as long as labor markets are as strong as they are, the new normal is 4 million workers a month being able to say to their employers, you better give me a better job, or I'm going to go out and find myself a better job. And I think it's the one indicator that tells us, frankly, what workers are thinking, because you don't quit a job unless you either have another job in hand, or you're getting ready to retire, to Aaron's point, or you think you will be able to find a job fairly readily. So to me, that's a measure that workers are feeling fairly powerful in the individual labor market. Now, it's not all workers, I think, and I'd love to see a breakout by industry, by age, by other demographic characteristics. But I think that statistic continues to tell us that worker power, individual worker power, remains pretty strong. So as the moderator's prerogative, that's going to be the last word in the analysis of the Bureau of Labor Statistics Employment Situation Report for March. I'm going to bring the conversation to a close right there. I want to thank today's guests, Alicia Modestino, Bill Spriggs, and Aaron Sojourner, for their expert insights and their continued excellent work. You can find them all on Twitter, tweeting out their highest level graphs and thoughts. I want to thank Lexi Anderson, our producer, technical producer, and our social media star of the day. Before you leave this blog, please subscribe to the blog so we can keep you updated on all the great content that we're producing. And if you subscribe, we will send you the weekly download, which is a collection of 20 or more articles, academic studies, other materials that we find on the web relating to workers and worker power and unions, and we'll share it with you directly into your inbox. You can also find the weekly download every week on Fridays on the Power at Work blog. It's a terrific resource. I hope you will use it, subscribe so that you can get it delivered directly to you in your inbox. So thanks for joining us today. We will see you again on the blog very soon. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks.